Hello everybody, Igor here, and for anybody new here, I make casual reviews, and they're just my opinion, so take everything I say with a giant grain of salt. But today's not a normal review. I am doing my next installment in my great classic album series, and once again, for anybody new, the way I do these videos for the classic album series is I essentially pick 10 albums that I think are higher than maybe an 8 out of 10 throughout history. That could be anything from before I started this channel, so really anything before 2020. I am very loose with my definition of classic. I tend to think of how important it is to the artist's discography, how important it is to me as a listener. So once again, like I said, take everything with a grain of salt. This isn't meant to be too serious. Today I have a lot of albums from the 2010s on here, and I know a lot of older listeners and older viewers might not view them as classic, but in terms of the artists, in terms of my own personal listening, these are just 10 classic albums that I enjoy quite a bit. But we are going to start off with an album from 1983, and I am of course talking about Robert Plant's The Principle of Moments. On one of his earliest solo albums, really not long after the breakup of Led Zeppelin, this really seems to see Robert Plant really tackle a much more mellow, soft rock, sort of soft pop sound. And honestly, I think it paid off in probably the best way possible. The big single from this big log, I've brought it up before on this channel, is one of my favorite songs of not only the 80s, but of Robert Plant's career. I think that it is a beautiful, much more mellow, with pop rock song with one of the best clean guitar riffs I've ever heard, and some of the best clean guitar work as well. Overall, I think this is this very concise 8-track album, which is his second solo album. I think displays excellent musicianship across the board on tracks like In the Mood as well, another great one. And overall, I just think much of Robert Plant's solo material in general is just massively overlooked. I honestly could have picked this album as well as his one with Alison Krauss or his 2017 album Carry Fire. They are all great albums, but The Principle of Moments really does come across to me as a great transition for Robert Plant from his more hard rock and Led Zeppelin days into his much more, subtle solo material, which I thought was perfect, and I think that The Principle of Moments is the perfect representation of his early solo career. So that is why Robert Plant's The Principle of Moments from 1983 is on this list. The next album I'm going to be talking about is from 1984, just 1 year later, and they are very different albums. Dead Can Dance's self-titled album, Dead Can Dance. In my opinion, while some of their later albums might get a bit more praise overall, I think Dead Can Dance, their self-titled album, is a wonderful milestone in not only 80s goth rock, but also just atmospheric goth and rock music in general. The debut album from this Australian duo may not be their most praised work, but I think it is arguably their most gothic-sounding work, and I think the most groundbreaking release they put out. In many ways, it takes a more atmospheric approach of the sound that had already been sort of popularized by bands like Bauhaus, which I love quite a bit, and when I say that, I kind of mean Bauhaus's sound on The Sky Has Gone Out. And overall, I feel like this album, the self-titled album from Dead Can Dance, is honestly like a seamless blend of that goth music, of a bit of world music in there as well, and so much more. Overall, I don't have too much really to say here other than the fact that I wish that this album got more praise in their discography. I think songs like The Trial are some of the best goth rock songs I've ever heard, and honestly, I think Dead Can Dance really does go above and beyond, even on their debut album. So yeah, I feel really comfortable putting Dead Can Dance self-titled on this list. The next album I'm going to be covering is kind of going down that goth route. I was sort of digging a little deeper into some goth albums over the past few months, or past few weeks, or whatever. Clan of Zymox, self-titled album from 1985. This is another self-titled album, and it is the debut album from the Dutch goth and dark wave band Clan of Xymox, and it is, in my opinion, a quintessential album in the development of more industrial and synth-based and atmospheric goth rock of the 80s. It's very easy to compare a band like Clan of Zymox to the likes of Depeche Mode, which I like quite a bit, but there is something a bit different about their sound. They also know when to... There's a good versatility on here. There's songs that slow it down, speed it up, are a bit darker, are a bit more dancey. Overall, I think Clan of Xymox is definitely one of those bands from the 80s and the more goth scene that is kind of criminally overlooked by the masses. I think they are a really strong group, and I think their self-titled album is honestly their strongest. Yeah, A Day, Stranger, great tracks. I think that overall, I wish they got more credit, and that's really all I got to say. We're going to jump ahead a little bit, 5 years to 1990, and this is one that I've been actually wanting to talk about a little more in depth, so I might go a little longer into this one. Daniel Johnston's 1990 from 1990. For those of you who don't know who Daniel Johnston is, I only recently discovered him as well, admittedly. There's just something so pure and innocent about his work. He struggled with his mental health for most of his life and was diagnosed with bipolar disorder as well. And on the surface, his music may come across very amateur and unimportant, and you could easily write him off as being just a bad musician and not worth your time, but the lo-fi qualities of his music and just the impulsiveness of it makes it like a portal into his mind in a way that very few artists are able to really capture. You could almost hear the sporadicness going on in his head on this album. 1990, in my opinion, is his best work. I feel like it is the perfect blend of the lo-fi qualities of the really just kind of thrown together mixtapes that he put out back in the 80s, but also with some of his best songwriting material and some slightly better recording. It's not too lo-fi. It's a bit better recorded. The folky, more chamber and piano-based sound of this album on many tracks really makes this my favorite from him. He has experimented with a ton of different sounds throughout his life, with a bunch of different synth stuff in there as well, but I think 1990 really has a great folky and chamber sound to it, with a lot of piano work and acoustic work that really makes it an even more heartfelt and personal album in my opinion. And honestly, yeah, the writing on this album I think is some of his best. The songs True Love Will Find You in the End and Some Things Last a Long Time I think are some of his greatest written songs, and overall just some of his best material. Overall, I think you kind of need to be ready. You need to go into his music with the right mindset, but I think Daniel Johnston really was one of the most important artists for mental health reasons, and just I think overall he has relatively good material that I think often gets overlooked because of its sort of amateur recording quality. But yeah, that is why Daniel Johnston 1990 from Daniel Johnston is on this list. The next album is from 1997, and it is Elliot Smith's Either Or. Elliot really does have a knack for writing some of the most heart-wrenching and heartbreaking and music imaginable. I mean, quite frankly, there is just something so infectious about his sound as well. Well, it's very easy to, once again, write off this guy as being too depressing and too depressive. It's written pretty damn well, and I don't care if it's a bit depressing. It's a very personal and realistic album. It might be a bit pessimistic, but it is one of the best written albums from this era in terms of folk and this kind of style of music. Well, I already talked about his self-titled album from 1995 in the first episode on my Great Classic Album series, an album that I love quite a bit. It's even more minimal than Either Or. Either Or is just too good not to talk about. It's just a solid album, front to finish. Very few songs that really drag this project down. I don't really have too much else to say other than the fact that Elliot Smith really is one of the best songwriters of the 90s. He really writes some of the most, deep and thoughtful music imaginable. And, yeah. However, one of the things that, from my personal standpoint as a listener that I've picked up on with much of Elliot Smith's music and Either Or, is it makes me nostalgic for my own past. Like my own past memories in a very melancholic way that very few artists can do other than Elliot Smith. It's really weird because I didn't start getting into Elliot Smith until, once again, relatively recently in my life. So, and yet somehow his music kind of gives me nostalgia of my own, growing up. And obviously, I'm young. I'm sure you could tell by looking at me. I'm relatively young. I'm not that old. It's not like I'm an old man looking at my past. And yet, for some reason, Elliot Smith's music still brings out those feelings and emotions. It's really a special experience that very few artists really can achieve, but Elliot Smith does, especially on Either Or from 1997, and that is why that album safely lands on my great classic albums list. We're jumping ahead 13 years. We are entering the 2010 section. There's a lot of albums I wanted to cover here. We're starting off with an album from 2010, The Drums' self-titled album, The Drums. The dreamy, beachy, summer, post-punk revival sound of The Drums' debut album, I think is one of the most unique albums I have heard of this style. It is an odd balance of the sort of seriousness, but also a bit of childness about this project. There's an interesting innocence to it, a bit of fun, a bit of, just having fun, summer sound of this project that really is really interesting to me, because a lot of these post-punk bands tend to get a bit darker, a bit more serious, but there's just something so fun and, full of life on The Drums' debut album. Songs like Let's Go Surfing is without a doubt a classic, and it somehow gives me, and yet even though it is much more uplifting, not that depressing, somehow The Drums give me a bit of a Joy Division throwback on this project. I don't know if it's because of the more minimalist instrumentation on here, but overall, I just think The Drums are one of those bands that are just, at least on their debut album, a band that I come back to quite a bit. I think they have a really solid sound, and I think everybody should check them out. Don't have too much else to say here other than the fact that I think they have a very unique post-punk sound that really makes them stand out against a lot of the other post-punk bands out there. But yeah, everybody needs to check out the very nice, beachy and summery sound of The Drums' debut album. It's a great album for the summer. And that is from 2010, and that's why it's on my list. And then we're going to jump ahead to 2012 with Grimes' Visions. Even though Grimes' 2020 LP, Miss Anthropocene, is my personal favorite in her discography, and I talked about it quite a bit last year, Visions is without a doubt a milestone in not only Grimes' career, but also synthpop in the 21st century. Tracks like Oblivion really have an infectiousness about them that make me come back to it time and time and time again, and I think are some of the best synthpop tracks of the past 20 years, honestly. I think Grimes really did solidify her sound on Visions to a point where I think up to this point it was her most mature album, her most cohesive album, her most thorough album, and overall with tracks like Oblivion and Genesis, overall there's without a doubt that Grimes really had perfected her craft up to this point on Visions. And while I personally think she would go on to make an even better album in 2020 with Miss Anthropocene, I think Visions is without a doubt aging very well. It sounds very classic, and it is undeniably an influential album on much of the synthpop we hear today. So I feel very comfortable putting Grimes' album Visions on this list. And now we're going to go to 2016 with Frank Ocean's Blonde. Even though Channel Orange seems to get a slight bit more praise, Blonde, in my opinion, has aged the best in his discography. Frank Ocean goes down an even more abstract and atmospheric sound and tone on this album, which is different from his more past albums. It's Blonde's avant-garde R&B sound and its lush arrangements not only make this a standout for Frank Ocean's career, but also in sort of popular music as well. Overall, it's a very consistent album that is great to put on in many instances if it's a listen where you want to listen to it very carefully, or if you just want to put it on in the background. Overall, Frank Ocean really hit it out of the park with Blonde, with, I think, an album that has become one of the most influential albums of the past 5 years. And, yeah, I think this album speaks for itself. It's pretty well praised. I'm sure many people here have already heard it. But yeah, Frank Ocean's Blonde is without a doubt, I think, Frank's best album to date. He hasn't even followed it up yet. So I can only hope that Frank Ocean goes above and beyond and manages to make an album even better in the future. But yeah, I feel really comfortable putting Frank Ocean's Blonde on here. It's a very influential and important album of the 2010s. Now we're going to go to 2018 with Pusha T's Daytona. This is probably the most hip-hop oriented album on this list today, and it is an extremely concise and powerful statement in hip-hop. Also, Kanye West produced this on his string of albums he was producing in, 2018, which featured Kids See Ghosts, Yay, you name it. But I think this is some of Kanye's grimiest production and beats. It features some of his most in-depth and raw and gritty productions, I think, on this entire project. And at just 7 tracks long, Pusha T has one of the most powerful and consistent deliveries here than he does on really any of his other solo projects. It's a relatively short album with not too much really to talk about, other than the fact that it is an album that has grown on me a ton since I first heard it. Pusha T continues to grow on me as an artist, and Daytona is honestly my favorite work from him. It's short, it's concise, but it is to the point, and it gets the job done. It is all the songs here, because they are just 7-song long album, they are all perfectly well crafted. There was no need for any extra filler. It's all killer on the Daytona, and it's definitely one of the best hip hop albums from 2018. So I feel really confident putting Pusha T's Daytona on this list. And the 10th and final album we are going to be talking about here is from Tyler, the Creator, Igor, from 2019. Well, both this album and Flower Boy are massively acclaimed. Igor, in my opinion, feels like Tyler's most mature project yet. The neo-soul and more adventurous and abstract sound of Igor makes this, in my opinion, a standout in his discography. Obviously, songs like Earthquake are massively popular, but at the end of the day, I feel like Tyler created an extremely consistent album with, once again, just like Pusha T, very little filler. It is all killer. It has produced his best. It's a very nice, abstract production. It does have a little bit of lo-fi elements in there, but calling it lo-fi would be a bit of a stretch. It is still a very well and nice, polished production. The opening track really grabs you in with that really droning synth. And overall, the neo-soul sound of this album, I think, is so far Tyler, the Creator's most impactful work so far. And I can only hope that he follows it up with a project of this level or higher, because so far he's on an upwards trend with each release, and Igor is the pinnacle of it. And with that being said, those are the 10 albums from Robert Plant, Dead Can Dance, Clan of Zymox, Daniel Johnston, Elliot Smith, The Drums, Grimes, Frank Ocean, Pusha T, and Tyler, the Creator, that I think are relatively classic albums. I recommend everybody check these albums out if you haven't already. And that is it. And once again, this is all just my opinion, so take everything I say with a massive grain of salt. You guys all know I love making these kinds of videos because I love finding, discovering, and talking about classic and older albums. And yeah, that is it for now. See you next time, and goodbye.